Hi, thank you, Yun, for organizing such a wonderful webinar. So today I'm going to talk about designing feminism in Chinese documentary, which 中国独立纪录片的女权欲望, which based on several articles I recently wrote. One of the article was published on Chinese Independent Cinema Observer. You can have open access to on the CFA's website. The other articles are coming up soon and reviewed. So before I talked about these documentary films on the list, I would like to briefly introduce my approach of studying feminist the documentary from the feminist point of view. So I used to adopt a Foucauldian approach, which and being informed by the studies of desire in Chinese society in Hong Kong, such as Lisa Raphael's Designing China book, and Hossein and Zeng Jinyan's book on sex and desire in Hong Kong. In 2016, I worked with Hossein to curated a series of Designing China documentary screening and discussions at the University of Hong Kong. So this series was intended to explore the discipline of sex as the deployment of social powers on individuals, and the desire is seen as a resistant power that transforms oneself and reforms the society one is living in on screen. So in my study, my Foucauldian inquiry centers not only on the power relations among documentary participants, but also on scrutinizing the reproduction of power structures in intellectual activity and the representational politics, distinguishing the seizure power as well as partnership and resistance as positive power or positive forces. Also, I conducted reflexive conversations with documentary participants, including to filmmaker, protagonists, and all birth identity holders, to open up spaces for examining key ethical concerns in Chinese independent documentary films, including the treatment of protagonists before, during, and after filming, the question of informed consent, solidarity, and the filmmakers' commitment to activist causes, and the ethics of distribution and exhibition of films about domestic violence and other types of abuse, and general concerns about the balance between privacy and public right to know. These conversations have addressed the complexity of documentary participants' positions, while privacy, like inner, personal, family, and 私 means profit, 私利, or immoral desires, 私欲, not appropriate for the public to view. And to also including the dealing with trauma, pain, which are represented in documentary films. So in my research, I adopt a feminist point of view to understand sex, gender-based violence, and the representation of female subjectivity in documentaries, and address the filmmakers' concern on ethics. My feminist perspective, I will argue that differentiate from in the gendered asymmetries of representation in the ethos of masculinity and domination, even in the documentaries and literature regarding subtle or vulnerable groups, such as in the ethical controversy of wheat harvest. This approach recognizes femininity and the experience of disadvantaged documentary participants in the representation and reasoning. So I wish, yeah, you will read my article. So I don't go to many details, but I would like to highlight a few examples of this film being screened during Designing China feminist Designing China film screenings. For example, the Hooligan Special, which also Designing China screening poster used the Ye Haiyan, the Arcade Hooligan Sparrow's protest photo as the main visual for the advertisement event. So in the documentary film Hooligan Sparrow, it's about actually feminist fight, feminist solidarity between the activists and netizens, and also between the filmmakers and on the screen, but also off screen, to fight against the child sexual abuse and the political hunting of activists. So the filmmaker edited her own the story of documentary filmmaking in the process of doing documenting activist fight against child sexual abuse. So this filmmaking became one of narrative in the film. Through this way of filmmaking, the feminist fight of protagonist men, protagonist hers, and the protagonist theirs become a fight of ours in solidarity with support and care to each other, also on screen and off screen. I would like to particular to mention there's the video documentation Ai Weiwei's interview with Ye Haiyan on August 26, 2010, which I will say the interview for short was met in 2010, but it was released on YouTube on June 3rd, 2013 during Ye Haiyan's detention. This is a talking head style the video documentation, but very powerful, with the questions were presented as subtitles in the video, so which makes the film, the documentation, video documentation, more or less like Ye Haiyan's monologue as a self-confession. So in the interview, I will argue that it's somehow Ye Haiyan's nuanced video love letter to Ai Weiwei, sharing her self-understanding of the separation of mind and body while doing sex work, a message about her ability to keep herself autonomy and her desire to look for a soulmate like Ai Weiwei, the imaged and the actual relationship between interviewer and interviewee pushed Ye Haiyan to present her innermost authentic self during the video interview, which creates a very intensive appeal to the interviewer, and also audiences should be canned in a way, a confessor in this semi-personal and semi-public video letter under Ai Weiwei's gaze, of course. But also, I mean, I want to highlight Ye Haiyan's confession in the interview is very powerful because it adopts an angel empowerment approach and depicts grassroots women's collective suffering and their vulnerability to sexual violence in particular. Ye Haiyan's position of appeal is grounded in demonstrating women's agency in recognizing female desire, female pleasure, dealing with sexual violence, and establishing their own autonomy, though they experience lots of traumas and violence. So through experience, they experience violence and sexual violence and facing discrimination. Ye Haiyan, a woman like her, she demonstrates she is able to heal and to organize others for self-help and support each other, and also to mobilize the public for social change and to advocate equality for everyone, girls, women, and sex workers in particular. And also with on the Designing China screening series, we screened a film about extramarital relationship, And so Yang Lina, the film director of The Life of Law, reflected that even though the film's protagonists do not mind if I screen the film, however, I am clearly aware that their understandings about media are different from ours. They are not aware of the power of dissemination. So while the protagonists choose to show the public their immoral positions, they provoke the public or intend to legitimize their controversial practices from their own perspectives. This perspective often contradicts the interests of other protagonists, such as the wives of those being having extramarital relations. So if filmmaker acts in the interest of the one protagonist, it may have negative consequences for the other protagonists or often birth. So the filmmakers, both Lian Qi and Lao An, A Song of Love, maybe, they used the strategy of develop the documentary by showing the footage and editing to protagonists in the process of editing to gain the mutual consent understanding of how to develop that documentary film, and also control the distribution of these two films to reduce the impact on the protagonist. And the other documentary film, Nightingale, not the only voice, because the protagonists are also filmmaker. So parents does not like their on-screen image. So the film was not screened to the public for 15 years. And after 15 years of personal life changes, communication, and director and protagonist self-transformation, on self-understanding, on domestic violence and family history, family practice during the Cultural Revolution and the land revolt, family history, the impact on the nowadays family relationship, etc. So the filmmaker eventually agreed to screen the film again for the first time after 15 years. About 15 years of not screening it. So I won't go to details, but yeah, again, you are most welcome to read my article. And also, I would like to address two films, 姐姐 by Hu Xinyi and My Soul by Xu Tong, which were not screened the film during the Designing China screening discussions, but also very important for discussion in terms of its content, etc. So 姐姐, the film sisters details the tensions of a mother-daughter relationship and when a teenage daughter who used to live with the Chinese father and Japanese stepmother in Japan, China, is newly arrived in the US to live with her mother and the American stepfather. So and during the process, the mother's memories of experiencing long-term domestic violence and its consequences in her previous marriage were triggered in dealing with this mother-daughter relational conflicts. So in a way, this film is very interesting for gender studies and family studies scholars and students, but in other way, because the protagonist consider the risk of private life being judged by the public audience holding conventional values against regarding domestic violence and abortion, miscarriage, family, and intimacy. So the mother decide to ban the screening out of the film. And for the My Soul wheat harvest, and this very notorious controversy reflects a power struggle between the filmmaker and distribution participants and the protagonists and their supporters, like sex worker angels in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and feminist groups who intervened and banned screening in cinemas in these places. Basically, previous studies are focused on the issue of informed consent, the invasion of sex workers' privacy, and endangerment of protagonists' lives through the exhibiting of the documentary and shifting power dynamics around representing sex workers by the filmmaker or by the sex workers themselves or by sex worker angels or feminist groups or by scholars, film scholars who want to discuss this film. So it's very complicated. From my feminist point of view, Wheat Harvest myself provides a very powerful on-screen portrait of a rural woman, gaining her independency and agency through sex work on the outskirts of Beijing, and her own subjectivity as a modern woman from the marginalized social status emerges through the images of her life traveling between rural hometown and urban Beijing. But sex work is illegal in China and participants are discriminated against by the public, which poses great legal risks, threats of gender-based violence and moral challenges for the protagonist, which I think the filmmaker and also distributor and the public, the film critics should take this worldly life needs in consideration to balance their desire of distributing the film. And also to remove, for example, for the filmmaker, remove protagonist detailed personal information from film, which is not a big issue to in terms of film narratives. Yeah, so I think also this controversy details the representation of oppressed in politics, using the political representation of the oppressed in politics, using the political logic of social activism and the practical goals of worldly life, might partially sacrifice the voice of the subject and as in philosophy and in arts, or it's vice versa. So this controversy, I think, invites filmmakers to reflect on their care for their documentary participants' worldly life. It also urges activists to problematize the political representation of the subject, therefore to discover and represent the voice of the deprived groups as they can speak for themselves. Yes, and I would like also to mention a poem to Liu Sha, which was scripted by me and made by Trish McAdam, a short 3D animation, which was made with the motivation of representing Liu Sha as in arts and in politics. First of all, Liu Sha is a forbidden artist for poet, photographer, and painter in China, and her art is very powerful in terms of expressing her resistance, even though she is not that kind of personality to speak in politics publicly. But sadly, she was often and until still now being presented in popular discourses, public discourses, NGOs, media, and merely as the wife of a political dissent, then the widow of Nobel Peace Prize Laureate Liu Xiaobo, who passed away in 2017. While in this discourses, her own subjectivity has faded and even been erased from such kind of narratives. So I wrote the script and I used Liu Xia's own to photograph it, collaborating with visual artist Trish McAdam and her 3D animation team to represent Liu Xia as if she speaks for herself through her own art. first of all, as a forbidden artist, a victim and a survivor of political violence, and then the wife of Liu Xia, a widow of Liu Xiaobo. So, and also yeah, basically stopped here. Please follow, meet my work if you want to know more about my writing about women 15 minutes on the position of nonviolence. And also I will recommend you to read Ai Xiaoming's, my interview with Ai Xiaoming on the documentary film Gender and Activism in China, especially on the legacy of women activists being represented on screen, and how to ethnic minority and queer filmmakers Shito and Mingming to do queer community making through their visual work, and also my own visual work in Ukraine Whisper. To use, for example, in this photo, to use this image and animation and soundtrack to restage and represent the feelings and experience of gendered and political violence experience and trauma and healing. I will stop here now, and we will have discussion during Q&A section. Thank you so much.